Edgar Allan Poe was a master of the macabre. He wrote horror, he wrote poetry, criticism, fiction, mystery. He was a master of suspense.
Edgar Allan Poe, called by many the father of the detective story, was born on January 19, 1809, in Boston, Massachusetts.
When Poe was 2 years old, his mother passed away, and his father had already abandoned the family. He was taken in as a foster child by the Allan family.
He was writing poetry from about the time that he was 13. He kept writing all the time. He worked very, very hard at his writing and wrote constantly.
In 1826, Poe enrolled at the University of Virginia. He went into debt, he gambled to try to pay off those debts and found himself in even greater debt and ultimately had to withdraw from the university. In 1830, Poe enrolled at West Point.
After West Point, Poe turned to writing full-time and lived in a number of East Coast cities before settling down in Richmond, Virginia.
Edgar Allan Poe secretly married his 13-year-old cousin, and then in 1836 publicly married her in a more open ceremony.
He loved her very, very much. They lived together always until, alas, she died of tuberculosis when she was, I guess, around 20.
Poe's primary occupation as a writer was as a literary critic. He worked at several newspapers and literary magazines, and he had quite a reputation for being a harsh critic. One of his editors called him the Tomahawk Man.
During his lifetime, he barely made a living from his writing.
Poe published some of his most famous short stories in his 1840 collection, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque.
He wrote some of his stories using the first person and talking about the use of opium, so people assumed that he dabbled in drugs. The stories were so creepy. They were ghost stories taken to such a brilliant extreme that people thought he had to be a little strange himself.
Poe invented detective fiction when he wrote The Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841.
Murders in the Rue Morgue really deserves to be called the first detective story. It started the whole tradition of detective fiction.
The Raven, which was published in 1845, was his huge breakthrough. It became a big bestseller.
Poe's career very much went up and down until he really hit The Raven, and that poem was known by, it seems everyone in the world. It had an enormous press.
On October 7, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died at the age of 40 under mysterious circumstances.
Poe's death may be one of the most bizarre things about his life. He left Virginia on his way to New York, disappeared. A week later, he was found on the streets of Baltimore.
We don't have a single piece of information about what he was doing. At the end of that week, he was found in a tavern, ill, drunk, and was taken to a hospital.
It turned out he was wearing clothes that didn't belong to him, and a couple of days later he died in a delirium. Nobody knows exactly what killed him.
Edgar Allan Poe's legacy in American literature is very detectable in all of the mystery dramas and stories we have, and all the kind of horror and vampire work that we see, that there is that trace of the sort of horror and mystery that Poe really was able to harness in his writing.
Poe is an American icon. I think he's more than a writer.
Even today, more than 150 years after he died, everybody loves Edgar Allan Poe.
Born in 1809, he lived only 40 years. In that short time, he battled depression, alcohol and drug addiction, sickness, and the untimely loss of his parents and his wife. But despite his short and tragic life, he produced a remarkable literary legacy, penning such nightmarish tales as The Fall of the House of Usher and The Pit and the Pendulum. His story, The Gold Bug, is considered the first modern detective mystery. Ironically, the author's own premature death remains cloaked in mystery. On October 3, 1849, he stumbled semi-conscious into a Baltimore tavern and died a short time later. Was he drunk, drugged, or the victim of foul play? To this day, the answer's unknown, but his cultural legacy is secure. Each year, mystery writers compete to win the annual award that bears his first name. Recently, the citizens of his adopted home, Baltimore, named their football team the Ravens in honor of his most well-known poem. Their mascot, a dark and menacing bird, is known as Poe, as in Edgar Allan Poe.
Poe's life was a constant struggle to make ends meet. Many times his mother-in-law begged for him. She would go out and try to solicit either work or loans of money for the family.
Poe was often his own worst enemy, sabotaging his efforts as they verged on success. In 1842, he secured a meeting with U.S. President John Tyler to request a government job.
He showed up for the appointment quite intoxicated. He was wearing his cloak inside out. He was disheveled. And fortunately for Poe, the president's son, Robert Tyler, intercepted him first and said, "Why don't you come back in a few days?" When Poe showed up for the second meeting, he was quite sober and conducted himself very well at first. But then, through some bizarre quirk, he decided to use the opportunity of this meeting not just to secure the president's help in getting a position in the Customs House, but to solicit magazine subscriptions from him.
He was driven to sink his own ship, as if that early experience of being abandoned himself created a kind of chronic pattern of needing to do himself in some strange, perverse way.
Poe, like his characters, was forever caught in a struggle between rationality and irrationality, order and chaos.
Logic was very important to Poe. He created the detective story because of his need for order and logic in his life. Some people have said he may have created the detective story in order that he not go mad.
In 1841, Poe published The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first detective story and a direct forerunner to Sherlock Holmes. His French detective Auguste Dupin uses analytical reasoning to investigate a series of hideous slashing murders. The final solution defies all logic. The murders have been committed by a razor-wielding orangutan.